Welcome to Bible Story Time, and thank you for joining us. Today's story is one of the most difficult and heartbreaking in all of Scripture. It is not a story of victory or miracles, but of consequence and loss. It is the story of a promise that seemed to die as a nation was brought to its knees. This is the story of Judah's exile to Babylon. For generations, the prophets of God had warned them. Men like Isaiah and Jeremiah had pleaded with the kings and the people of Judah to turn back to God. They had abandoned the covenant, worshipped idols, and ignored the cries of the poor. God's patience, after centuries, had reached its end. The storm came from the east in the form of Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon. The end came in waves. First, King Jehoiakim of Judah rebelled. The Babylonian army surrounded the city of David, the jewel of Israel. The king surrendered, and Nebuchadnezzar stripped the temple and the palace of their treasures. He took the king into exile, along with the leaders, the soldiers, the craftsmen, and the smiths, 10,000 of the best and brightest. It was a crippling blow. Nebuchadnezzar then placed a new king on the throne, Zedekiah. But Zedekiah was a weak and foolish king. He made a vow of loyalty to Babylon, but then, listening to false prophets, he broke that vow and rebelled. This time, there would be no mercy. The full might of the Babylonian army returned and laid siege to Jerusalem. They built siege works around the city, and the gates were slammed shut. No one could go in or out. For nearly 2 years, the city starved. The Bible paints a grim picture of mothers who could no longer feed their children, of desperation turning to horror in the streets. Hope withered and died within the city walls. Finally, the walls were breached. The Babylonian soldiers poured into the city like a flood. King Zedekiah and his soldiers tried to flee in the night, but they were captured on the plains of Jericho. They were brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and a terrible judgment was passed. In front of Zedekiah, they slaughtered his sons. Then they put out his eyes, so the last thing he would ever see was the death of his children. Blind and broken, he was bound in bronze shackles and taken away to Babylon. The destruction was not over. The Babylonian commander came to Jerusalem and carried out his orders with brutal efficiency. He set fire to the Temple of Solomon, the glorious house of God, the center of Israel's worship for 400 years. The place where God's presence was said to dwell went up in flames. He burned the royal palace and all the great houses of Jerusalem. He tore down the walls that had once protected the city. The remaining people were rounded up. All but the poorest of the poor were forced to march on a long, dusty road of grief, away from their homes and into exile in a foreign land. The city of God was a smoldering ruin. The promised land was empty. The Davidic throne was vacant. It seemed like every promise God had ever made had turned to ash. This is not just a story of a military conquest. It is a story of a broken heart, the heart of a nation and the heart of God. It is the ultimate consequence of turning away from the one who had given them everything. But even in the ashes of Jerusalem, a different kind of story was beginning. This was not the end of God's people. It was a painful, fiery refining. In the foreign land of Babylon, with no temple and no king, the people of Judah would be forced to find God in a new way. They would cling to His words, the Scriptures. They would learn to worship through prayer and community. Their faith wouldn't be in a building anymore, but in the character of the God who, even in judgment, had not completely abandoned them. The prophets, like Ezekiel and Daniel, would rise up in exile to give them hope of a future return. The fall of Jerusalem is a somber reminder that choices have consequences, but it is also a testament to a God whose plans cannot be ultimately defeated. He allowed the city to fall, but He preserved a remnant. He allowed the temple to burn, but He would one day become the temple Himself in the person of Jesus. The exile was a death, but it would be followed by a resurrection. So when we face our own moments of exile, when the life we built crumbles, when we feel far from God and our hope seems lost, we can remember this story. We can remember that even in the ruins, God is at work. His discipline is not for our destruction, but for our restoration. Thank you for watching Bible Story Time. If this story spoke to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. These ancient stories still breathe life, because even in the ashes, God is planting the seeds of a future restoration.